The Battle of Chancellorsville was a major battle of the American Civil War, and the principal engagement of the Chancellorsville campaign. It was fought from April 30 to May 6, 1863, in Spotsylvania County, Virginia, near the village of Chancellorsville. Two related battles were fought nearby on May 3 in the vicinity of Fredericksburg. The campaign pitted Union Army Marsh. Gen. Joseph Hooker's Army of the Potomac against an army less than half its size, Gen. Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. Chancellorsville is known as Lee's perfect battle, because his risky decision to divide his army in the presence of a much larger enemy force resulted in a significant Confederate victory. The victory, a product of Lee's audacity and Hooker's timid decision-making, was tempered by heavy casualties and the mortal wounding of Lt. Gen. Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson by friendly fire, a loss that Lee likened to "losing my right arm." The Chancellorsville campaign began with the crossing of the Rappahannock River by the Union Army. On the morning of April 27, 1863, Union cavalry under Marsh. Gen. George Stoneman began a long-distance raid against Lee's supply lines at about the same time. This operation was completely ineffectual. Crossing the Rapidan River via Germanna and Elias Fords, the Federal infantry concentrated near Chancellorsville on April 30. Combined with the Union force facing Fredericksburg, Hooker planned a double envelopment, attacking Lee from both his front and rear. On May 1, Hooker advanced from Chancellorsville toward Lee, but the Confederate general split his army in the face of superior numbers, leaving a small force at Fredericksburg to deter Marsh. Gen. John Sedgwick from advancing, while he attacked Hooker's advance with about 4/5 of his army. Despite the objections of his subordinates, Hooker withdrew his men to the defensive lines around Chancellorsville, ceding the initiative to Lee. On May 2, Lee divided his army again, sending Stonewall Jackson's entire corps on a flanking march that routed the Union 11th Corps. While performing a personal reconnaissance in advance of his line, Jackson was wounded by fire from his own men, and Marsh. Gen. J.E.B. Stuart temporarily replaced him as corps commander. The fiercest fighting of the battle, and the second bloodiest day of the Civil War, occurred on May 3 as Lee launched multiple attacks against the Union position at Chancellorsville, resulting in heavy losses on both sides. That same day, Sedgwick advanced across the Rappahannock River, defeated the small Confederate force at Mary's Heights in the Second Battle of Fredericksburg, and then moved to the west. The Confederates fought a successful delaying action at the Battle of Salem Church and by May 4 had driven back Sedgwick's men to Banks's Ford, surrounding him on three sides. Sedgwick withdrew across the ford early on May 5, and Hooker withdrew the remainder of his army across U.S. Ford the night of May 5–6. The campaign ended on May 7 when Stoneman's cavalry reached Union lines east of Richmond. Background: Union attempts against Richmond, Indiana, the eastern theater of the American Civil War. The basic offensive plan for the Union had been to advance and seize the Confederate capital, Richmond, Virginia. In the first 2 years of the war, 4 major attempts had failed. The first, founded just miles away from Washington, D.C., at the First Battle of Bull Run in July 1861. Marsh. Gen. George B. McClellan's Peninsula Campaign took an amphibious approach, landing his Army of the Potomac on the Virginia Peninsula in the spring of 1862 and coming within 6 miles of Richmond before being turned back by Gen. Robert E. Lee in the 7 days battles. That summer, Marsh. Gen. John Pope's Army of Virginia was defeated at the Second Battle of Bull Run. In December 1862, Marsh. Gen. Ambrose Burnside commanded the Army of the Potomac and attempted to reach Richmond by way of Fredericksburg, Virginia, where he was defeated at the Battle of Fredericksburg. This string of Union defeats was interrupted in September 1862 when Lee moved into Maryland and his campaign was turned back by McClellan at the Battle of Antietam, but this represented no threat to Richmond. Shake-up in the Army of the Potomac. In January 1863, the Army of the Potomac, following the Battle of Fredericksburg and the humiliating Mud March, suffered from rising desertions and plunging morale. Marge. Gen. Ambrose Burnside decided to conduct a mass purge of the Army of the Potomac's leadership, eliminating a number of generals who he felt were responsible for the disaster at Fredericksburg. In reality, he had no power to dismiss anyone without the approval of Congress. Predictably, Burnside's purge went nowhere, and he offered President Abraham Lincoln his resignation from command of the Army of the Potomac. He even offered to resign entirely from the army, but the president persuaded him to stay, transferring him to the Western Theater, where he became commander of the Department of the Ohio. Burnside's former command, the 9th Corps, was transferred to the Virginia Peninsula, a movement that prompted the Confederates to detach troops from Lee's army under Lt. Gen. James Longstreet, a decision that would be consequential in the upcoming campaign. Abraham Lincoln had become convinced that the appropriate objective for his Eastern Army was the army of Robert E. Lee's, not any geographic features such as a capital city. But he and his generals knew that the most reliable way to bring Lee to a decisive battle was to threaten his capital. Lincoln tried a fifth time with a new general on January 25, 1863, Marge. Gen. Joseph Hooker, a man with a pugnacious reputation who had performed well in previous subordinate commands. With Burnside's departure, Marge. Gen. William B. Franklin left as well. Franklin had been a staunch supporter of George B. McClellan and refused to serve under Hooker, because he disliked him personally and also because he was senior to Hooker in rank. Marge. Gen. Edwin V. Sumner stepped down due to old age and poor health. He was reassigned to a command in Missouri, but died before he could assume it. Brig. Gen. Daniel Butterfield was reassigned from command of the 5th Corps to be Hooker's chief of staff. Hooker embarked on a reorganization of the army, doing away with Burnside's Grant Division system, which Hooker considered unwieldy. He also no longer had sufficient senior officers on hand that he could trust to command multi-corps operations. He organized the cavalry into a separate corps under the command of Brig. Gen. George Stoneman. But while he concentrated the cavalry into a single organization, he dispersed his artillery battalions to the control of the infantry division commanders, removing the coordinating influence of the Army's artillery chief, Brig. Gen. Henry J. Hunt. During the spring of 1863, Hooker established a reputation as an outstanding administrator and restored the morale of his soldiers, which had plummeted to a new low under Burnside. Among his changes were fixes to the daily diet of the troops, camp sanitary changes, improvements and accountability of the quartermaster system, addition of and monitoring of company cooks, several hospital reforms, an improved furlough system, orders to stem rising desertion, improved drills, and stronger officer training. Opposing forces. Union. The Army of the Potomac, commanded by Marge. Gen. Joseph Hooker, had 133,868 men and 413 guns organized as follows. 1st Corps, commanded by Marge. Gen. John F. Reynolds, with the divisions of Brig. Gens. James S. Wadsworth, John C. Robinson, and Abner Doubleday. 2nd Corps, commanded by Marge. Gen. Darius N. Couch, with the divisions of Marge. Gen. Winfield Scott Hancock and William H. French, and Brig. Gen. John Gibbon. 3rd Corps, commanded by Marge. Gen. Daniel Lee Sickles, with the divisions of Brig. Gen. David B. Birney, and Marge. Gens. Hiram G. Berry and Amy L.W. Whipple. 5th Corps, commanded by Marge. Gen. George G. Meade, with the divisions of Brig. Gens. Charles Griffin and Andrew A. Humphreys, and Marge. Gen. George Sykes. 6th Corps, commanded by Maj. Gen. John Sedgwick, with the divisions of Brig. Gens. William T. H. Brooks and Albion P. Howe, Maj. Gen. John Newton, and Col. Hiram Burnham. 11th Corps, commanded by Maj. Gen. Oliver O. Howard, with the divisions of Brig. Gen. Charles Devons, Jr., and Adolph von Steinwehr, and Maj. Gen. Carl Schurz. 12th Corps, commanded by Maj. Gen. Henry W. Slocum, with the divisions of Brig. Gens. Alpheus S. Williams and John W. Geary. Cavalry Corps, commanded by Maj. Gen. George Stoneman, with the divisions of Brig. Gens. Alfred Pleasanton, William W. Averell, and David M. Gregg. Confederate Gen. Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia fielded 60,892 men and 220 guns, organized as follows. 1st Corps, commanded by Lt. Gen. James Longstreet. Longstreet and the majority of his corps were detached for duty in southeastern Virginia. The divisions present at Chancellorsville were those of Maj. Gens. Lafayette McLaws and Richard H. Anderson. 2nd Corps, commanded by Lt. Gen. Stonewall Jackson, with the divisions of Maj. Gen. A.P. Hill, Brig. Gen. Robert E. Rhodes, Maj. Gen. Jubal A. Early, and Brig. Gen. Raleigh E. Colston. Cavalry Corps, commanded by Maj. Gen. J.E.B. Stewart. The Chancellorsville campaign was one of the most lopsided clashes of the war, with the Union's effective fighting force more than twice the Confederates', the greatest imbalance during the war in Virginia. Hooker's army was much better supplied and was well rested after several months of inactivity. Lee's forces, on the other hand, were poorly provisioned and were scattered all over the state of Virginia. Some 15,000 men of Longstreet's corps had previously been detached and stationed near Norfolk in order to block a potential threat to Richmond from Federal troops stationed at Fort Monroe and Newport News on the peninsula, as well as at Norfolk and Suffolk. In light of the continued Federal inactivity, by late March Longstreet's primary assignment became that of requisitioning provisions for Lee's forces from the farmers and planters of North Carolina and Virginia. As a result of this, the two divisions of Maj. Gen. John Bell Hood and Maj. Gen. George Pickett were 130 miles away from Lee's army and would take a week or more of marching to reach it in an emergency. After nearly a year of campaigning, allowing these troops to slip away from his immediate control was Lee's gravest miscalculation. Although he hoped to be able to call on them, these men would not arrive in time to aid his outnumbered forces. Intelligence and plans. My plans are perfect. May God have mercy on General Lee, for I will have none. Maj. Gen. Joseph Hooker. Hooker took advantage of improved military intelligence about the positioning and capabilities of the opposing army, superior to that available to his predecessors in Army Command. His Chief of Staff, Butterfield, commissioned Col. George H. Sharp from the 120th New York Regiment to organize a new Bureau of Military Intelligence in the Army of the Potomac, part of the Provost Marshal function under Brig. Gen. Marciner R. Patrick. Previously, intelligence gatherers, such as Alan Pinkerton and his detective agency, gathered information only by interrogating prisoners, deserters, contrabands, and refugees. The new BMI added other sources including infantry and cavalry reconnaissance, spies, scouts, signal stations, and an aerial balloon corps. As he received the more complete information correlated from these additional sources, Hooker realized that if he were to avoid the bloodbath of direct frontal attacks, which were features of the battles of Antietam and, more recently, Fredericksburg, He could not succeed in his crossing of the Rappahannock, except by stratagem. Hooker's army faced Lee across the Rappahannock from its winter quarters in Falmouth and around Fredericksburg. Hooker developed a strategy that was, on paper, superior to those of his predecessors. He planned to send his 10,000 cavalrymen under Maj. Gen. George Stoneman to cross the Rappahannock far upstream and raid deep into the Confederate rear areas, destroying crucial supply depots along the railroad from the Confederate capital in Richmond to Fredericksburg, which would cut Lee's lines of communication and supply. Hooker assumed that Lee would react to this threat by abandoning his fortified positions on the Rappahannock and withdrawing toward his capital. At that time, Hooker's infantry would cross the Rappahannock in pursuit, attacking Lee when he was moving and vulnerable. Stoneman attempted to execute this turning movement on April 13, but heavy rains made the river crossing site at Sulphur Spring impassable. President Lincoln lamented, "I greatly fear it is another failure already." Hooker was forced to create a new plan for a meeting with Lincoln, Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton, and General-in-Chief Henry W. Halleck in Aquia on April 19. Hooker's second plan was to launch both his cavalry and infantry simultaneously in a bold double envelopment of Lee's army. Stoneman's cavalry would make a second attempt at its deep strategic raid, but at the same time, 42,000 men in three corps would stealthily march to cross the Rappahannock upriver at Kelly's Ford. They would then proceed south and cross the Rapidan at Germanna and Elias Ford, concentrate at the Chancellorsville crossroads, and attack Lee's army from the west. While they were underway, 10,000 men in two divisions from the 2nd Corps would cross at the U.S. Ford and join with the 5th Corps in pushing the Confederates away from the river. The second half of the double envelopment was to come from the east. 40,000 men in two corps would cross the Rappahannock below Fredericksburg and threaten to attack Stonewall Jackson's position on the Confederate right flank. The remaining 25,000 men would remain visible in the camps at Falmouth to divert Confederate attention from the turning movement. Hooker anticipated that Lee would either be forced to retreat, in which case he would be vigorously pursued, or he would be forced to attack the Union Army on unfavorable terrain. One of the defining characteristics of the battlefield was a dense woodland south of the Rapidan known locally as the Wilderness of Spotsylvania. The area had once been an open broadleaf forest, but during colonial times the trees were gradually cut down to make charcoal for local pig iron furnaces. When the supply of wood was exhausted, the furnaces were abandoned and secondary forest growth developed, creating a dense mass of brambles, thickets, vines, and low-lying vegetation. Catherine Furnace, abandoned in the 1840s, had recently been reactivated to produce iron for the Confederate war effort. This area was largely unsuitable for the deployment of artillery and the control of large infantry formations, which would nullify some of the Union advantage in military power. It was important for Hooker's plan that his men move quickly out of this area and attack Lee in the open ground to the east. There were three primary roads available for this west-to-east movement: the Orange Plank Road, the Orange Turnpike, and the River Road. The Confederate dispositions were as follows. The Rappahannock line at Fredericksburg was occupied by Longstreet's 1st Corps Division of Lafayette McLaws on Mary's Heights, with Jackson's entire 2nd Corps to their right. Early's division was at Prospect Hill, and the divisions of Rhodes, Hill, and Colston extended the Confederate right flank along the river almost to Skinker's Neck. The other division present from Longstreet's Corps, Anderson's, guarded the river crossings on the left flank. Stuart's cavalry was largely in Culpeper County near Kelly's Ford, beyond the infantry's left flank. Initial movements. April 27–30. Movement to battle on April 27–28. The initial three corps of the Army of the Potomac began their march under the leadership of Slocum. They crossed the Rappahannock and Rapidan rivers as planned and began to concentrate on April 30 around the hamlet of Chancellorsville, which was little more than a single large, brick mansion at the junction of the Orange Turnpike and Orange Plank Road. Built in the early 19th century, it had been used as an inn on the turnpike for many years, but now served as a home for the Francis Chancellor family. Hooker arrived late in the afternoon on April 30 and made the mansion his headquarters. Stoneman's cavalry began on April 30 its second attempt to reach Lee's rear areas. The two Second Corps divisions crossed at U.S. Ford on April 30 without opposition. By dawn on April 29, pontoon bridges spanned the Rappahannock south of Fredericksburg and Sedgwick's force began to cross. Pleased with the success of the operation so far, and realizing that the Confederates were not vigorously opposing the river crossings, Hooker ordered Sickles to begin the movement of the Third Corps from Falmouth the night of April 30, May 1. By May 1, Hooker had approximately 70,000 men concentrated in and around Chancellorsville, in his Fredericksburg headquarters. Lee was initially in the dark about the Union intentions and he suspected that the main column under Slocum was heading towards Gordonsville. Jeb Stuart's cavalry was cut off at first by Stoneman's departure on April 30. But they were soon able to move freely around the Army's flanks on their reconnaissance missions after almost all their Union counterparts had left the area. As Stuart's intelligence information about the Union River crossings began to arrive, Lee did not react as Hooker had anticipated. He decided to violate one of the generally accepted principles of war and divide his force in the face of a superior enemy. Hoping that aggressive action would allow him to attack and defeat a portion of Hooker's army before it could be fully concentrated against him, he became convinced that Sedgwick's force would demonstrate against him, but not become a serious threat. So he ordered about 4/5 of his army to meet the challenge from Chancellorsville. He left behind a brigade under Brig. Gen. William Barksdale on heavily fortified Mary's Heights behind Fredericksburg and one division under Maj. Gen. Jubilee Early on Prospect Hill south of the town. These roughly 11,000 men and 56 guns would attempt to resist any advance by Sedgwick's 40,000. He ordered Stonewall Jackson to march west and link up with Maj. Gen. Richard H. Anderson's division, which had pulled back from the river crossings they were guarding and began digging earthworks on a north-south line between the Zoan and Tabernacle churches. McLaws' division was ordered from Fredericksburg to join Anderson. This would amass 40,000 men to confront Hooker's movement east from Chancellorsville. Fortunately for the Confederates, heavy fog along the Rappahannock masked some of these westward movements and Sedgwick chose to wait until he could determine the enemy's intentions.